Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susan Frederick, and I am from NCSL's Washington, D.C. office. I staff our Cybersecurity Task Force. Today, I am joined by several of my colleagues who also staff our task force for NCSL. Abby Gruhl, who's also from our Washington, D.C. office, and Pam Greenberg from our Denver office. We also have special guest Wendy Underhill from NCSL's Denver office, who works on election security issues for the conference. Before we get started, click below and let's take a quick poll. While you're doing that, I'll give you a password fun fact. There is such a thing as World Password Day. It's May 2nd. And one of the most common passwords to this day actually showed up in our polling question. It is 123456. And it looks like we have some results. The best password, the most secure password is indeed WHT exclamation point 5Z. Congratulations, folks. You are taking one step closer to not being hacked. Before we move on to our first speaker, I want to tell you a little bit more about our cybersecurity task force. NCSL formed this task force back in 2015. And over the last 5.5 years or so, we've had many robust meetings and webinars and have produced numerous work products, such as our conversation guide, our budgeting guide for cybersecurity, various legis briefs and state research documents, and our governance guide, all of which can be found on our task force website and in the resource section of this webinar. So to tell you a little more about state cyber trends, I'm going to turn the program over to Pam Greenberg.
Okay, let me get things things going here. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk first a little bit about cyber criminals, and then I'm going to talk about trying to get ahead of them. So these seemingly innocuous creatures you see represent some of the most dangerous groups that are committing cyber crimes. Cybersecurity firms and researchers have come up with these names. So first of all is a group called Cozy Bear, and that's a Russian hacker group. It's believed to be associated with Russian intelligence agencies, and they are behind the infamous SolarWinds attack, which we'll hear about a little bit more later. And then there's Domestic Kitten. That's an Iranian surveillance operation that targets political dissidents and could pose a threat to the Iranian regime and other political dissidents. Lastly, Anchor Panda and other panda named groups. You've probably already guessed that they're a Chinese operation. They've targeted US companies like those involved in satellite systems and aerospace and defense industries. And there are many more. And I'll talk a little bit more about threats and also about what legislatures can do about them. But first, I'm going to move back to some computer crime basics. When we talk about computer crime, we're talking about the computer as a tool or the computer as a target. And use of the computer as a tool, for example, could be sending phishing emails or cyber stalking, online harassment, those kinds of things. When the computer is the target, the goal is to damage systems, get unauthorized access, or to intercept data, so, for example. So anyway, today, mostly we're going to be focusing on the computer as a target. And then in looking at who commits these crimes, who they are, and why they do what they do. Well, the number one motivation, not surprisingly, is money. But they're also motivated by political reasons or causes, or even just for fun, or to satisfy their ego, or get status within some of these groups. Many, however, are nation state actors and increasingly organized crime groups. And then as we move to types of cyber attacks, So what are these criminals doing? They're installing malware, including viruses, spyware, ransomware. And this group called the Domestic Kitten Group, like probably most of the others, they're responsible for a number of ransomware attacks. The vast majority of breaches are a result of phishing attacks. And I'm sure you're all familiar with those kinds of emails, too familiar if you're like me. But a group called Hidden Cobra used spear phishing to target high-level coronavirus vaccine researchers, a big problem. And then there's a group called the Lizard Squad. And they've launched a number of denial of service attacks. So what they do is they use computer traffic to overwhelm or flood systems so that a website can't be accessed. When they use multiple systems or botnets, it's called a distributed denial of service attack. And Lizard Squad mostly attacked internet gaming sites, but they also claimed responsibility for taking down the Malaysian Airlines website and others. And then Bad Rabbit. They've spread malware by setting traps on insecure websites so that anybody who even just visits that website gets malware downloaded to their computer. And then Cozy Bear and many of the others are what we call advanced persistent threats. Typically, they are a nation state or state-sponsored group, and they gain unauthorized access to a computer system, a computer network. And then they remain undetected for an extended period of time, sometimes quite an extended period of time, while they're watching and learning from the networks that they're on. Cozy Bear inserted malicious code into a software update of a company called SolarWinds, which I'm sure you've heard of. And that company monitors the performance of computer networks and servers. So when an upgrade was launched from that company, it was spread, this malicious code was spread throughout all of the companies and many of them that were using it. It was only detected fairly recently by a number of cybersecurity firms, but it has been present in federal agencies like Treasury and Commerce, and also state government agencies, and of course, businesses. So moving on to sort of trends in internet crimes, we're seeing more cyber attacks and more sophisticated cyber attacks. The FBI has reported steadily increasing numbers of complaints over the past 20 years. And then costs of cybercrimes. Well, losses from cybercrimes that individuals and businesses report to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center are in the billions. And these are the top 10 states with the biggest losses in 2019. And then the cost of data breaches. We know how prevalent those are. A data breach is incredibly costly, costs related to forensics, legal advice, sending notifications. And of course, there's also the cost related to for individuals whose data is compromised. The costliest breaches occur in the healthcare, energy, and financial sectors, but it's also not small potatoes for the public sector. And then COVID-19 amplifies everything. I think I certainly feel that way. You probably feel that way. So many of us are working from home, regularly accessing systems and resources through sometimes insecure home networks and using our personal devices. That also increases the burden on IT staff who are doing their regular jobs and support, but then they need to support and provide for remote work. But there's also been just a big uptick in cyber attacks related to COVID-19. Oh, there's fake versions of the Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard with malware on it. There are fake CDC emails, phishing emails, fake contact tracing apps, phony vaccine offers. And then there are the imposters who say that they need your personal information before you can get your stimulus check. So not fun. And obviously, given all of this, cybersecurity According to a couple of surveys that have been done very recently, cybersecurity is the #1 priority and the #1 challenge for state and legislative chief information officers, and not to mention businesses. But these are two recent surveys that were gauging that of IT professionals. And then moving on to challenges and opportunities. Again, just a few of the challenges related to cyber crimes that the states and businesses are facing. Limited budgets, of course, lack of skilled workers, cybersecurity work. We do not have enough professionals, IT professionals who are skilled in that area. And then training challenges and many more. But we're also seeing legislative initiatives that can address some of these challenges, and we're seeing those in a number of states. For example, tax incentives that are for cybersecurity businesses, security workforce training programs, cyber threat sharing, information sharing across levels of government and with the private sector is something that's of growing importance. Mandates requiring the adoption of training, cybersecurity standards, and best practices in government. And then effective governance structures, things like statewide chief information security officers, or a centralized approach to state government cybersecurity practices. And then lastly, the funding just doesn't, the problem of funding doesn't go away. The need for and providing for increased or dedicated funding for cybersecurity. So there are a lot of laws already in place, state laws for most cyber crimes. So for example, all 50 states have computer crime laws, and they criminalize unauthorized access, malware, viruses, those kinds of things, ransomware increasingly. They might do that even if they don't do that specifically. But we're also seeing continued legislation related to computer crime laws that would do things like increase penalties or address new types of crimes that are popping up that might fall through, might be a loophole that needs to be filled. All 50 states also have security breach notification laws, but we're seeing amendments that would cover breaches of biometric data, other types of sensitive data, sensitive personal information, or amendments that would require more timely reporting. And then many states also have laws requiring businesses or state agencies to have security practices in place. Sometimes it's just reasonable security practices, and increasingly it's specific guidelines or requirements that we're seeing. Other legislation includes measures directed at the insurance industry, efforts to keep government security plans and procedures confidential. If they would have been normally a public record, now we're trying to make sure that that information, sensitive information, doesn't get released. And then last but not least, a big issue is election security. And so from my last slide here, I just wanted to highlight again a few resources that may be helpful in looking at ways to address cyber crimes in your state and to understand and learn more about these issues. Our Managing Cyber Threats Through Governance is a recent report, Budgeting for Cybersecurity Conversation Guide. So I'm also happy to provide examples of cybersecurity legislation, that some of the kinds of things I've talked about, or other information. So with that, I will turn it back to Susan.
Thanks so much, Pam. Before we turn to our next speaker, and just to keep it kind of interesting here, let's try another poll question. And while you're doing that, I will give you another did you know? Did you know about public Wi-Fi networks? By positioning themselves between you and the connection point, hackers can read your emails, steal your passwords, and even hijack your website logins. In some cases, they can also read your emails that are going out and received, as well as texts you might be sending. So it looks like we have some mixed results here, 50-50 on yes and another 50 on no. So we generally would hope that you would not use the public Wi-Fi network. It does have the tendency to be a little unsafe. Just be careful. And we'll move on to our next speaker. And so, as Pam had mentioned, election security has been a very hot topic in the states for a number of years. And here to tell us more about state actions in this area is our elections expert, Wendy Underhill.
Thank you, Susan. And everything Pam said is so right on. And some of what I'm going to say is going to show how those broad concepts work in one subject area. And my guess is if you had someone here to talk about cybersecurity and electric grids or transportation, you could have those same general concepts apply to their areas as well. So, but I'm going to talk about election security. And the first thing I want to say is that we do not have information in the United States of any votes being altered through a cyber attack. That's where we are now. Department of Homeland Security has said that. Hard to know all of the details around the corner, but as far as we know, there's been none of that kind of hack. Even so, for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to make the case that states cannot take their eye off the ball when it comes to election security. So, of course, we know from Pam and Susan that cybersecurity is pretty scary and it can affect many parts of our lives, including big corporations that you would think would have deep enough pockets to be able to protect. It's tough to do. So Target's been hacked. We know that the federal government has been repeatedly hit, and Pam mentioned the SolarWinds Act that hit the National Nuclear Security Administration in December. And then it itself, the SolarWinds, is a company that was supposed to be providing cybersecurity for others. And then earlier this month, the Florida water treatment plant had a cyber breach that almost led to the addition of dangerous amounts of lye to the water. There was a alert employee there who stopped that before it happened. So humans are often our best defense. So when you think about cybersecurity on a grand scale, there's a lot to be concerned about. When you think about it in regard to elections, one thing I want to mention is that elections are the foundation on which our representative democracy is built. So it really does matter a huge amount that we keep it as secure as we can from intrusions from foreign sources or domestic as well. So let's look at the big picture as defined by the Department of Homeland Security's Election Cybersecurity Agency. It's tried to put all of the functions that go into an election system on one page. And I'm sharing it here not so that you'll understand every piece of it, but so that you'll know that it's kind of complicated and that there are many different places that a threat might come and that somebody's looking at it from that perspective. But for us, I just want to look at a couple of things that are in the box marked number 1, and that's voting itself and voter registration. And we'll start with the voting. So there are many different ways that votes are cast. Of course, each vote counts the same. That much we are probably pretty sure on. And again, I'll reiterate, knock on wood, voting itself has not been attacked by cyber criminals. And I think that can mostly be attributed to the fact that voting equipment, what we actually cast our ballots on and what we count our votes on, are not connected to the internet. The same, however, cannot necessarily be said about voter registration systems. Of course, voter registration is way different than voting itself. The vote is the thing that is so precious. The voter registration is the gateway to it and helps keep us organized. So it's not good if it gets tampered with. If you do have tampering with the voter registration system, you sow chaos, and the chaos starts with C, which rhymes with T, which of course we all know stands for trouble. So why are voter registration systems more vulnerable than voting? As I mentioned, voting equipment isn't connected to the internet at any point. So if an intrusion were to happen, it would have to be done one machine at a time. And that's a hard way to alter the results of a major election. But voter registration must be connected. That's the very nature of a statewide database. It's connected throughout the state. And with registration, individuals may register on a piece of paper that could take place at an election official's office, or it could take place in front of a grocery store or a library when there's a registration drive going on. I know we didn't have those kinds of drives during COVID, but presumably we will in the future as well. And then those pieces of paper get carried somewhere and somebody has to key in the information from them into the database. And then in 40 states, there's online voter registration. And of course, if you're going online to register, there's several different ways that they can keep that very secure. And that's a good question to ask in your state. How do you make sure your online voter registration system is a secure one? And then most states have registration taking place at the Department of Motor Vehicles. That's it could be automated, it could not be automated, but either which way, there's some amount of transactions that are coming from your DMV to the voter registration database at the state level. And so what this means is that a voter registration database is dynamic. Information is coming in, information is being taken out as voters move away. And that means that there's a large attack surface. And officials in local jurisdictions, of course, need to have access to this so that they can print or fill their poll books, whether they're electronic poll books or their paper poll books. And with every person in the state who has access, there's more opportunities for those phishing attacks that Pam talked about. Your state's IT director or your state election director will probably be able to tell you all the ways in which bad actors are snooping around the perimeter of their voter registration system and the things that they've done to protect them. And it's hard to stay ahead, but that's the whole effort, is to be thinking about what are the kinds of attacks, learn from what's going on in other states, and make sure that you've got, you might say, your windows and shut and locked and your doors locked. Don't make it easy for people to get in. This is also a place where ransomware could have a problem for a state, and where denials of service could cause grief as well, two of the other things that Pam mentioned. So just because we haven't had a disaster so far doesn't mean that we couldn't have a disaster in the near future. And here's where you get that second opportunity to hear some of the same stuff. The bad actors out there come in different categories. There's the nation state actors, there's the black hat hackers, the terrorists, the criminals, the politically motivated groups, and even insider attacks. And what's from the point of view of these bad actors, they may not actually even intend to change any votes or to mess with the voter registration list, because those are pretty hard to do. But spreading disinformation can be enough for these bad boys. Foreign troll farms are active every day with the intent of ramping up social division in our nation. And it's proving very hard to set policies that address disinformation. So I'd say that as emerging policy topics for the 2020s go, how to balance the constitutional right for free speech with a concern for the damage that can be done by disinformation is something that's going to be an emerging topic and become a hot topic. We do know that the states are the laboratory for democracies. I said that wrong, are the laboratories of democracy. Let's get that right. So I can easily imagine over the next several years, we'll see a number of ideas on how to address that disinformation part of it. So why haven't things been worse than they have been? I can't actually prove causation on this, but I'm going to say that since 2016, there's been a huge sea change in the way states think about election security. There's been a huge amount of new attention put on this at all levels of government. For instance, the federal government made elections a critical infrastructure sector. That's an official title within the Department of Homeland Security. And that gives the federal government the ability to share the resources it has with states and with local jurisdictions as well. And also Congress has made appropriations that relate to security, one in 2018, and one at the very beginning of 2020, and one a little bit later in 2020. So there has been some money made available because it's recognized that this isn't a threat at the local level or the state level, it's really a threat nationwide. Now, I will say that there's no expectation that that federal funding is going to be a steady stream. It's, I think, before 2018, the last time any federal money was devoted to elections was in 2002. So it's not something that states can be counting on. And then in general, everywhere you go, local election officials and state election officials have been drilling on what does cybersecurity mean for them? And some of them are even saying, okay, we've heard this before, enough, we've got some other things to do as well. So between federal assistance, federal money, and lots of training, we're in a different place than we were a few years ago on this. And it is an unusual place where I'd say that the state, the local, and the federal actors are all playing really nicely together in this space. I'm not sure that's always true everywhere else. So then we could look at what state lawmakers have been doing on cybersecurity. it's fair to say that mostly cybersecurity is an issue that is handled through the executive branch, but that doesn't mean that there's not a legislative and a policy role as well. I'm not going to go through every one of the states, but I'm happy to if anybody wants to ask me about any of these individual ones. But I will summarize by saying that what you're seeing on the screen here are enactments from 2019 and 2020, and they relate to requirements for training, requirements for reporting of incidents. In Ohio, the use of an approved, in Indiana, excuse me, the use of an approved cybersecurity vendor. So that means the state will vet the vendors that could be used. And then the creation of a cybersecurity reserve corps in Ohio. So that's just a variety of things. And then the one in Oklahoma requires that counties notify the State Board of Elections of any breaches, and also to implement cybersecurity and physical security measures, which is a good segue to my next slide. So what we've got here is that there's the old-fashioned kinds of security that has been built and tested over the course of decades. So you want to have your equipment locked up where it cannot be tampered with. You want tamper-proof seals on all of your equipment, and that includes the boxes that hold the ballots, and it includes the equipment that people vote on and the equipment that ballots are counted on. Everything needs to be locked up. You need to have a really well-trained staff. As I say, they have to be trained on many different things. Cybersecurity is one of them, but they also need to be trained on just good procedures and such things. You need bipartisan teams. Oftentimes those locks can't be opened unless people from two different parties are present to initial or use even their fingerprint to get a lock open. And then checklists. We all know that if you're going to run any big event, having a checklist is a good way to protect that event. Well, that goes double when what you're protecting are votes and election outcomes. So if you're interested in more on this was just the 101. We've got a couple of webinars coming up. Next week, we're going to be talking about knowing and showing an election is accurate. That'll be part of the 101 series. And then on March 18th, we'll do a webinar just on cybersecurity for elections. This is the 101. That'll be the 201. I don't think we'll ever be able to get to the upper class level on this, but we can point you to the people who can teach you at that level. We've also got a couple of web resources. I think you can find them below the video player on your screen. And then at NCSL, I guess I like to think that probably the most valuable resource that we can offer to the states is that we like to be on the phone with you and find out what's on your mind, what do you need, and then to find it, package it, and deliver it for you. We really do serve you in your roles in the legislature. So feel free to call on me or really anybody at NCSL. And with that, Susan, I think I'm done, and I will be here to answer questions if there are any.
Thanks so much, Wendy. That was such a great, informative kind of dissertation on the basics of election security. We've been working on this issue for a long time. It feels like longer than it actually has been. We're going to turn now to the federal sphere. And of course, before we do that, I would be remiss if I didn't say we had another question for you guys to answer. So go ahead and let's see if we can figure out what an example of a phishing attack is. And while you're doing that, here's some recent statistics about phishing attacks. They actually comprise about 80% of all cyber attacks, and about 90% of cyber attacks that result in a data breach begin with a phishing email. And over half of cyber criminals use phishing as their primary form of attack. And you guys are spot on. All of the above, that's exactly right. So I'm glad you guys know about that so that you don't fall into their trap. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Abby Gruel, who works in our Washington, D.C. office on cybersecurity issues. Abby?
Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm going to talk quickly about some of the few major players in federal cybersecurity regulation and program management. Most agencies have some sort of cyber component, but the prominent authority in the executive branch is the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security has a Science and Technology Directorate, which oversees cybersecurity research and development in information technology and operational technology systems. DHS develops emerging cyber capabilities to enhance the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure and the internet, including cyber data analytics, machine learning, malware analysis, software assurance and mobility, and also deals with elections, as Wendy mentioned. DHS's Cybersecurity Strategy was released in May 2018, and it presented a strategic framework to execute the government's cybersecurity responsibilities during the following 5 years. Both the strategy and the earlier Presidential Policy Directive 21 on critical infrastructure security and resilience emphasized an integrated approach to managing risk, lending greater credence to the creation of a separate cybersecurity agency. The federal government has worked to consolidate its cybersecurity authority in the past few years. Following a massive breach of the Office of Personnel Management in 2015, when sensitive personal data on 22 million current and former federal employees was stolen, it became increasingly clear to many experts that the federal government needed to improve its cyber posture to adequately create a national response to the growing threat of foreign attackers infiltrating critical resources. As vulnerabilities in the IT infrastructure became more clear and cybersecurity attacks ramped up, many were interested in creating a new agency to focus specifically on cybersecurity. The National Protection and Programs Directorate, which previously oversaw cybersecurity within the Department of Homeland Security, was a conglomeration of disparate security programs within DHS that didn't fit neatly in some of the other agencies such as TSA or FEMA. Over time, as the threat landscape evolved and the department's role became more clarified and strengthened by Congress, the department needed a single voice who was able to carry out the Homeland Security's critical infrastructure protection mission. What comes out of all of this is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which was created through the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act of 2018, surprisingly. The legislation rebranded the Department of Homeland Security's NPPD as CISA. CISA builds the national capacity to defend against cyber attacks within the federal government to protect and provide cybersecurity tools, incident response services, and assessment capabilities. They also safeguard the .gov networks that support the essential operations of other departments and agencies. CISA coordinates security and resilience efforts by using trusted partnerships across the private and public sectors. CISA also creates assessments to identify gaps and examinations of emerging technology to help determine the demand for future capabilities. CISA has a wide range of partnership advisory councils, including private sector, state, and local government. CISA also houses the National Risk Management Center, which is an important planning, analysis, and collaboration center working to identify and address the most significant risks to our nation's critical infrastructure. The agency is still operating under acting leadership right now, but will soon get an appointment from the president. CISA representatives have attended most of our cybersecurity task force meetings, and we work closely with the agency on state cyber readiness. Congress also has significant oversight, funding, and program development role in cybersecurity. The Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee and the House Homeland Security Committee, specifically the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure, and Innovation, are the committees of jurisdiction in this area. And Susan's going to talk more about the major legislation in Congress. There are also some important public-private partnerships that contribute to the cybersecurity policy space. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission was established in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act to develop a consensus on a strategic approach to defending the United States in cyberspace against cyber attacks of significant consequence. They finished their first report, which was presented to the public in March of 2020. And the fiscal year 2021 Defense Authorization Act reauthorized the commission and gave it expanded duties to review implementation of recommendations. The Solarium is led by bicameral, bipartisan co-chairs from Congress, has 10 commissioners, including 4 lawmakers and 6 private sector cybersecurity experts. With the passage of the fiscal year 21 NDAA, 25 of the commission's recommendations have been codified into law. Information sharing is also an important part of cyber readiness. Another important public-private partnership is what we call the MS-ISAC. And there are other information sharing analysis centers as well. So the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center with the Center for Internet Security helps to improve the overall security posture of state, local, and tribal as well as territorial governments through focused cyber threat prevention, protection, response, and recovery. And they hold a lot of information sharing sessions, both in preparation and response to incidents. So now Susan is going to talk about some specific congressional legislation.
Thanks, Abby. Before I get into the bills, I just want to say that Abby and I, as your representatives in Washington, D.C., we meet with a lot of these entities on a fairly regular basis. And I want to specifically mention CISA because they come to every single one of our cybersecurity task force meetings. They provide us with really informative briefings. They bring information for our members to take back with them home. They provide good contact information. So it really is a nice relationship that we have with the federal government on these issues. And then, of course, Abby and I meet with members on the congressional committees as well as legislation moves through the chambers of Congress. And now to get to that legislation, I have a couple of bills up on the screen here, and I'll just mention them briefly because we don't really have a lot that's been passed into law. And the one that we really would like to see move forward is this first one, HR 5823. And this bill directs the CISA director to establish a state and local government cybersecurity resiliency committee to provide state, local, tribal, and territorial stakeholder expertise, situational awareness, and recommendations. So obviously at NCSL, we would very much like to see that particular piece of legislation move forward. State and local government national associations like NCSL would have one member on this committee. The bill would also do a nice thing for us as well. It would give us some grant money to address cybersecurity risks across the board and cybersecurity threats to information systems of state, local, tribal, or territorial governments. It would contain a cost share of 10%, which I know in these times is probably going to be hard if it does pass. But nevertheless, there is a 10% cost share included in this bill, and it would increase incrementally to 50% by fiscal year 2025. This bill was introduced by Representative Cedric Richmond from Louisiana, who is now in the Biden administration. He is President Biden's senior advisor and director of the White House Office of Public Engagement. So we hope to see this piece of legislation reintroduced in the current Congress so that we can, again, advocate for its passage in hopes that we can get some money out to states to help with some of the cyber issues they're facing. The second bill up there is HR 1158. And this authorizes cyber incident response teams at the Department of Homeland Security. This team would maintain assistance to assist owners and operators, identify cybersecurity risks and unauthorized activity, as well as strategize to prevent future cyber risks. And this is a bill introduced by Representative McCall from Texas, and it was morphed and added into a larger appropriations bill. The third piece of legislation up there is HR 1668. And this was the purpose was to leverage federal government procurement powers to encourage increased cybersecurity for Internet of Things devices and to require NIST to do several things, most importantly, to develop and publish standards and guidelines for the federal government in the appropriate use and management of agencies of Internet of Things devices. And as you all are aware, usually when the federal government issues those types of standards, states tend to look at those and see which ones of those standards would apply in their state as best practices. In addition, this law would require projects designed to assist in managing potential security vulnerabilities associated with the use of traditional information technology devices, networks, and systems. HR 6395, which was a huge bill. This was the annual Defense Department authorization bill, which Abby mentioned in her remarks. And it contains a relatively large number of cybersecurity provisions, strengthening federal networks, CISA cybersecurity tasked to support those agencies, modification of the position of principal cyber advisor. As Abby mentioned, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission recommendations were put into law in this particular bill. It established the Department of Homeland Security Joint Cyber Planning Office and established a cybersecurity state coordinator, among other things. So the last piece of legislation is delivering the Voting Systems Act, which we are yet to see move very far, defending the integrity of Voting Systems Act. And that's pretty self-explanatory. There would have been some money attached to that piece of legislation. And we hope to see some of these people or some of these bills come back in the new Congress, hopefully with some grant money for states and some technical support. As we know, state cybersecurity is not the private sector, and it's really hard to retain and get good people to stay. So we would hope that some of these federal pieces of legislation would have appropriate support network in place to assist states. And, you know, just so you guys are aware, the Cybersecurity Task Force is, you know, it's not an open task force. You have to be cleared by your leadership to participate. But if you are interested in being a part of the Cybersecurity Task Force, you know, let us know, and we will try to make that happen if we can. But I think that about wraps it up for our folks here, and we're happy to take some questions if you have any, if you want to put your questions in the chat. And I'm going to close with that. Happy to answer any questions. Okay, I see one here. I think this one is probably going to be for Wendy. What are some things individuals can do to protect themselves, or can legislators do as candidates to protect their campaigns?
Okay, thank you, Susan. I think we've learned a few things. We should all be using two-factor authentication, which means that you might have to have a code come through on your phone before you can get into some parts of your computer. So beefing that up is a good thing. Getting a little bit of training, hopefully from your legislature, on how to avoid those phishing or spear phishing attacks. We get it at NCSL, it's called Ningio. They make it kind of fun, and we can all keep learning. I like the part where it's just a little bit after a little bit. There are some playbooks that are available for candidates. The Belfer Center has a playbook on how to keep your campaign safe. And they started that with congressional campaigns in mind, but they make it available to anybody. So that's an idea. Pam might have some other thoughts too. I guess just plain keep your computer to yourself and don't share your passwords with anybody, including your spouse and your kids. That's probably a good idea. Pam, anything else on how we can individually keep ourselves safe?
Wendy, you covered a lot there. You know, training though, I think is something to emphasize. And I think when legislative IT staff offer training, you know, for members of the legislature and for legislative staff, that's a great way to, you know, get up to speed on how to protect yourself. So I think that's my primary recommendation, is to take advantage of those when you can.
All right, we have one more question. Again, I'm going to throw this one over to Wendy. How can states know their vote was correct?
Well, that is an excellent question, one that certainly was front and center. There's a variety of things. One is to make sure that the voter registration list that we talked a little bit about is as clean as it can possibly be in advance. There's various ways to do that. So you start with a clean list, so ballots are only going to the people who should be getting them. Then when you count the ballots, you It's good if you've got a paper ballot, so you could recount it if you needed to. Most states do have a paper ballot now, but not all of them. And more important than recounting every single ballot is having an audit process so that you can look back and check were the machines doing their counting correctly. So we know what a tax audit is. You don't necessarily look at every receipt from the whole year, but you do look at a number of them. And if at a certain point you can say with some level of security that's working out. So there are that kind of audits that are available for elections. And you can also make sure that your local election officials are using really granular procedural lists, and that they're checking them off, and that it's called ballot reconciliation in the election world. But you want to be sure that for every ballot that was printed, there's an explanation of where it is. It's either being counted or it got destroyed, like eaten by the dog, or ink spilled on it, or whatever it might be. So there are some things, none of them are sexy and none of them are universal, but it's kind of the cumulative effect of a lot of small policies, right from even before the voting starts to certification, that can help ensure that the vote was counted correctly.
Thanks so much, Wendy. And I don't see that we have any additional questions, so I'm going to go ahead and close out this wonderful webinar. Thanks to everyone for attending, and to our fabulous presenters from NCSL. And again, if you guys need anything from us, you know how to find us at ncsl.org. And have a great weekend, everyone.